Here's how it works. Molecules that make up the stains form a complex with the enzyme. This results in the enzyme breaking the stain molecules into smaller sections that may be more easily dissolved. So far, the term enzyme has been used to describe a substance that is involved in chemical reactions. Let us get deeper into how these substances actually work. Enzymes are proteins made by living cells. In other words, they are biological catalysts which speed up chemical reaction without being changed in the process. Each enzyme has an active site which is formed due to the folding of long chains of amino acids. Another molecule, called a substrate, binds to the active site of the enzyme to form an enzyme-substrate complex. The substrate is the substance that the enzyme acts on in a biochemical reaction. This occurs so that a reaction can take place. When the reaction is complete, the product or products leave the active site. Without these catalysts, reactions would occur too slow to sustain life. One such reaction is digestion. When we eat, the food is broken down into simpler forms so that it can be absorbed and transported by the blood to cells for use. There are different types of digestive enzymes. Enzymes that break down carbohydrates are called carbohydrases. For example, amylase, which breaks down starch to glucose. Enzymes that break down proteins are called proteases. For example, trypsin, which breaks down proteins into smaller units called polypeptides. Enzymes that break down fats are called lipases. For example, lipase, which breaks down fats into smaller units called fatty acid and glycerol. Let's review. Enzymes are biological catalysts which speed up chemical reaction without being changed. Carbohydrases break down carbohydrates. Proteases break down proteins. Lipases break down fats. At the end of this section, you should be able to construct typical food energy chains and webs and demonstrate different trophic levels. What are some of the animals you may see when you go outdoors? Write them down. No doubt you may see butterflies, caterpillars, spiders, various types of birds, dogs, cats, rats, lizards, ants, grasshoppers, cockroaches, flies, bees, wasps, beetles, bugs, frogs, snakes, earthworms, millipedes, centipedes, and mongooses. Let us examine the feeding relationship among some of these animals. The grasshopper eats the leaves of the plant. The lizard eats the grasshopper. The bird eats the lizard. The cat eats the bird. Here's another example of saying the same thing. The caterpillar eats the leaves of the plant. The lizard eats the caterpillar. The bird eats the lizard. The mongoose eats the bird. How energy passes from one organism to another can be represented by a food energy chain. For example, in a field community, grass changes energy from the sun into chemical energy. The grass uses some of this energy for itself and stores the rest. A grasshopper can then eat the grass. The lizard then eats the grasshopper. The lizard is then eaten by the bird, which is later eaten by a cat. Energy from the sun passes through each link of the food chain. Each animal uses some of the energy to stay alive and store some in its tissues. When the animal is eaten, the energy stored in its tissues is passed on. At the end of this section, you should be able to identify the relative positions of producers and consumers in a food chain. Let us look at how energy trapped by plants is utilized by other living things and moves from one organism to another. Do you see that the energy in the plant is being incorporated into the caterpillar? And this energy moves up the chain to lizard, bird, and cat? Do you realize that if the plant dies, then the rest of the food energy chain dies? What changes do you think would happen if there were fewer caterpillars? You're quite right. If you said that if the population of caterpillar falls, then the lizard would have to find other food sources. What is clear is that if any member of the chain is lost, it affects the whole feeding relationship along the chain. Can you now draw another food chain from the list of animals that you have made? Here is one. Which member of this food chain would you consider to be the top predator? Yes, the owl, because it is at the top of the food chain. Notice that these feeding relationships are all over the world. They just include different species of plants and animals interacting to provide food for one another. Food energy chain exists in water, aquatic environments, and on land, terrestrial environments. So far we have looked at simple feeding relationships between terrestrial, that is, land-based animals. Now let us look at the feeding relationships between water-based, that is, aquatic animals. The marine environment is very active. Algae or seaweed uses sunlight to make its food and grows on the reefs. The snails eat the vegetation on the reef, the algae. Small fish eat the snails. Larger fish eat the small fish. A large bird like the pelican eats the large fish. The freshwater habitat has its own vibrant food energy chains. Here are 3 examples involving animals with which you are familiar. Note that plants always start the chain, but we must remember that the sun is the universal source of energy, and the plants are just making the sun's energy available to animals. In reality, all animals are dependent on plants to get food. Let us now identify the relative positions of producers and consumers in a food chain and relate feeding positions to their modes of feeding in a pyramid. In nature, food energy chains rarely exist in isolation because organisms usually have more than one source of food. The food energy chains are normally linked to form an interlocking pattern or network of feeding relationships called a food energy web. Let us now extend the food energy chain idea to show how many animals interrelate with one another to form this food energy web. Notice that many food energy chains connect to form a food web. We will now show you a set of food energy web. Write out a food energy chain from each of the food energy web as quickly as you can. For each of the food chain that you wrote, identify the producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. Analyze food energy web number 3 and name the organism that is both primary consumer and secondary consumer. Yes, you are correct. The answer is the rat and the small birds. Did you notice that they feed from 2 levels? Both the small bird and the rat eat nuts and grains from plants as well as insects. Consider food web number 3 and answer this question. Mr. James swept up all the dried and rotten leaves in his yard. Examine the energy web and suggest how a reduction in the amount of rotting leaves may lead to a reduction in the number of rats. The number of earthworms will decrease. The beetle population has to eat more moths. Population of moth decreases. Population of smaller birds decreases because there are fewer moths to eat. The carnivorous mammals have to resort to eating more rats. Let us introduce another idea relating to feeding levels. This idea relates to the word trophic level. Objective: explain the role of decomposers as facilitators of the return of nutrients to the soil. When we examine the carbon and nitrogen cycles, we see that decomposers are very important to the function of the cycle because they feed on dead material and help to recycle nutrients in the community. Decomposers must be represented on the food energy web because they break down and convert complex compounds to simple substances. This process releases nutrients which helps plants to become good primary producers. For example, the callaloo plant needs long, green, fleshy leaves so that it can provide lots of food for the consumer. The decomposers feed on decaying material and free up the nitrogen and make it available to the soil and therefore to the plants. Decomposers are mainly fungi, bacteria, and other animals such as earthworms and millipedes. Thanks to these decomposers, nutrients are freed up and the food energy web is enhanced.
Join Jamaica Limited, in association with the Ministry of Education and SED Jamaica Limited, present a series of e-learning videos geared towards preparing students for CXC examinations. This series focuses on biology. There are 10 videos, each lasting 20 minutes. Your narrator, Michael Anthony.
Part 1 covers living things and the environment. At the end of this section, you should be able to identify and describe feeding relationships within a community. Let's explore the feeding relationships further and in more detail. Feeding, or nutrition, is one of the characteristics of living things. The main reason humans and other animals feed is to obtain nutrients. These nutrients provide energy and repair worn-out tissues. What do you think would happen if all animals competed for the same food sources? Yes, you are correct if you said the food supply would become depleted in a short time, and large numbers of animals would die from hunger. Usually, different types of organisms live in the same environment. A group of organisms of the same species living together in a particular environment is called a population. For example, in a log there may be a red ant population or a millipede population. Different populations living together make up a community. Some populations in a community have a close, permanent feeding relationship with one another. The predator-prey relationship is the most common feeding relationship within a community. Predator is an animal that captures and eats other animals. The animal eaten by the predator is called its prey. A tiger and a cat are called predators, while the rabbit and the bird are preys. Remember, the predator eats the prey. Living organisms need energy to survive, move around, and do work. Each population within a community needs energy. They get this energy by the process of respiration, which breaks down the food they eat. The source of all this energy is sunlight. Plants get their energy from sunlight. How do plants use this sunlight energy to make food? The leaves are the main food factory for the plant. They have a mechanism for making their own food. Leaves have special cells which contain chloroplasts. Chloroplast contains the pigment chlorophyll, which allows plants to trap the energy in sunlight and convert this light into useful energy so that plants can use it to make food. Plants use this trapped energy to mix or combine carbon dioxide and water to form food. The carbon dioxide is obtained from the air and enters the leaves through tiny holes called stomata. The water is absorbed from the soil through their roots. The process by which plants make their food is called photosynthesis. The food made is called glucose. Glucose can be converted into different substances such as sucrose, which can be found in sugarcane and sweet fruits. Starch, which can be found in wheat, oils which can be found in peanuts, coconuts, and almonds, and proteins which can be found in peas and beans. These foods have the sun's energy trapped in them in the form of chemical energy. Because plants make their own food, they are called primary producers. Primary producers are organisms that make their own food. All communities need to eat producers to get energy. Living things that eat other living things for food are called consumers. Consumers do not make their own food, but get their food from a variety of sources. Consumers are divided into three groups. These are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers are organisms that feed directly on the producers. Primary consumers are herbivores. Herbivores are animals that eat only plants. Here are some examples of primary consumers. We will deal with secondary and tertiary consumers later. Horses, donkeys, goats, cows, rabbits, grasshoppers. A strict human vegetarian would be considered a herbivore. Secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are animals that feed on the primary consumers. They are carnivores. A carnivore is an animal that eats only meat. Here are some examples of secondary consumers. Hawk, tiger, crocodile, pelican, lizard. Tertiary consumers are animals that feed on the secondary consumer. They feed on all types of food. Some tertiary consumers are omnivores. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and animals. Bears, humans, dog are examples of tertiary consumers. We will use these terms again, so bear them in mind and be ready to use them again. Peas and beans. These foods have the sun's energy trapped in them in the form of chemical energy. Because plants make their own food, they are called primary producers. Primary producers are organisms that make their own food. All communities need to eat producers to get energy. Living things that eat other living things for food are called consumers. Consumers do not make their own food, but get their food from a variety of sources. Consumers are divided into three groups. These are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers are organisms that feed directly on the producers. Primary consumers are herbivores. Herbivores are animals that eat only plants. Here are some examples of primary consumers. We will deal with secondary and tertiary consumers later. Horses, donkeys, goats, cows, rabbits, grasshoppers. A strict human vegetarian would be considered a herbivore. Secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are animals that feed on the primary consumers. They are carnivores. A carnivore is an animal that eats only meat. Here are some examples of secondary consumers. Hawk, tiger, crocodile, pelican, lizard. Tertiary consumers are animals that feed on the secondary consumer. They feed on all types of food. Some tertiary consumers are omnivores. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and animals. Bears, humans, dog are examples of tertiary consumers. We will use these terms again, so bear them in mind and be ready to use them again. Identify a feature particular to a characteristic of the Bolt family. Note that the way in which the genotype is expressed is its phenotype. In the example shown, mice with the genotypes BB or BB will have the phenotype black-eyed color. BB represents homozygous dominant while BB represents heterozygous dominant. The genotype BB represents the homozygous recessive trait. Let's see what genotypic ratio and phenotypic ratio would result if two mice from the first generation selfed. Sickle cell anemia. A similar principle would be applied if predicting the results of crosses for genetic disorders such as sickle cell anemia and albinism. Let's take sickle cell anemia for example. This is a condition in which the afflicted individuals are unable to transport oxygen to their tissues properly because the molecules within red blood cells that carry oxygen molecules of the protein hemoglobin are defective. When oxygen is scarce, these defective molecules become insoluble and combine with one another, forming stiff, rod-like structures. This results in the formation of sickle-shaped red blood cells. In this case, individuals who carry one allele for normal hemoglobin and one for sickle cell hemoglobin are carriers and are said to have the sickle cell trait. Individuals who are heterozygous for the sickle cell allele are generally indistinguishable from normal persons. If two persons with sickle cell trait have children, there is a 1 in 4 chance that their child may have the disorder. Incomplete dominance. Not all alternative alleles are fully dominant or recessive in heterozygotes. Sometimes heterozygotes individuals do not resemble one parent precisely. Some pairs of alleles produce instead a heterozygous phenotype that is intermediate between the parents. In other words, blending occurs with the alleles. In impatiens, bombs, the flower petal is red, white, or pink. However, there are only two alleles, red and white. The heterozygous condition is pink. Multiple alleles. So far, we have examined situations in which a gene may only have 2 alleles. Sometimes, however, there may be more than 2 alleles that can occur at a given locus. Of course, in any one individual, only 2 alleles can be present. A clear example of such multiple alleles is provided by the alleles controlling the ABO blood group system in humans. The ABO system is controlled by 3 alleles, A, B, and O. The A and B alleles show equal dominance with respect to one another, i.e. they are codominant. But each is dominant to the allele O. If two group A parents who are heterozygous mate, there is a possibility that one of their offspring will belong to group O. Now see if you're able to complete this CSEC examination question 2007 Biology Paper 03. When studying genetics, there are terms with which you should be familiar. These terms include genotype, an actual genes present in an organism which may or may not be expressed in the phenotype. Phenotype, the observable characteristics of an organism. Note that the genotype can be influenced by the environment. For example, hair color. Some with naturally black hair, with undue exposure to the UV rays of the sun, can develop brownish red hair. Another example is that during a fast, a genetically fat person will lose weight. However, as soon as they are off the fast, they regain the weight as the genotype has adequate nutrition for true expression in the phenotype. Homologous chromosomes, a pair of matching chromosomes of maternal and paternal origin. Alleles, a pair of genes controlling alternative characteristics. Locus, the position of a gene on a chromosome. Heterozygous, both alleles are present at a locus. Example, one on each of the homologous chromosomes. Homozygous, the locus has the same allele on each of the homologous chromosomes. Dominant, the allele which controls the characteristic shown in the phenotype when inherited in the heterozygous condition. Recessive, the allele which is not expressed shown when inherited in the heterozygous condition. Inheritance with dominance. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, discovered the following rules. Genes normally exist in pairs, one of which may be expressed and is therefore dominant, and the other recessive. In a gamete, only one of the two genes is present. If the dominant and recessive genes are present together in an individual, it is the dominant one which produces an effect. The transmission of genotype and hence phenotype from one generation to the next can be mapped by using a genetic diagram. Let's use this example to map the transmission of a gene from one generation of cats to the other. In mice, black eyes B are dominant to brown eyes B. How can a black-eyed mouse mate with a brown-eyed mouse and produce only black-eyed mice?
E-Learning Jamaica Limited, in association with the Ministry of Education and SED Jamaica Limited, present a series of e-learning videos geared towards preparing students for CXC examinations. This series focuses on biology and highlights areas considered most challenging to our students. There are 10 videos, each lasting 20 minutes. Your narrator, Michael Anthony.
Syllabus objectives. Describe a chromosome as a length of DNA sections which are genes. Explain the meaning of terms gene, allele, dominant, recessive, incomplete dominance, genotype, phenotype. Use genetic diagrams to explain the inheritance of a single pair of characteristics. Predict the results of crosses involving one pair of alleles. Why do children look like their parents? Why do siblings resemble each other? The answer to these questions is that we inherit traits, characteristics from our parents. Genetics is the study of genes and the inheritance of traits. What exactly are traits? A gene is a length of DNA that codes for a particular protein or polypeptide, such as an enzyme. Thus, our genes encode the instructions that define our traits. We all have thousands of genes found in chromosomes. You may recall that a chromosome is a thread-like structure which carries genes in a linear sequence. These determine the individual characteristics of an organism. How do we get our traits from our parents? Humans have two complete sets of 23 chromosomes, that is, 46 in all of our body cells except red blood cells and sex cells. Each sex cell, gamete, only has 23 chromosomes due to meiosis. When a sperm cell fertilizes an ovum, the resulting zygote, fertilized ovum, has 46 chromosomes. Thus, when fertilization occurs, each parent passes on one complete set of chromosomes to the child. As such, genes are passed on. At wedding ceremonies, you must have heard the officiator say, "And the two shall become one." Chromosomes are contributed randomly from both parents to each child. Therefore, each sibling inherits a unique set of chromosomes. For this reason, some children may resemble their father and some may resemble their mother. Red-green color blindness is a form of color blindness in which red and green are perceived as identical. It is inherited in an X-linked recessive manner. Have you ever wondered why there are more men colorblind than women?
Good evening. My name is Dr. Hamid Gulam, and I'm here to speak to you about the various aspects of color vision, in particular color blindness. Now, the definition of color blindness is a deficiency in one's ability to discern certain colors. Color blindness can be acquired, or it can be congenital or genetic. The most prevalent form of color blindness would probably be genetic, where it is linked to the X chromosome, and on that X chromosome is a defective gene for color, which is in particular why men have the problem, have more of a problem with colorblindness. It's more prevalent in men than it is in women.
This is because the man need only inherit one X with the sex-linked gene that causes color blindness, and he will have the condition. Remember, he has one X and one Y. On the other hand, females would have to inherit two X's with the disorder to have full-blown color blindness, since it is a recessive disorder. It takes two recessive alleles for expression. Let's use a Mendelian map to show what would be the expected phenotypic ratio, physical manifestation, of children from a carrier female of colorblindness and a colorblind male. In this example, let B represent normal vision and B represent colorblindness. Revision.
E-Learning Jamaica Limited, in association with the Ministry of Education and SED Jamaica Limited, present a series of e-learning videos geared towards preparing students for CXC examinations. This series focuses on biology. There are 10 videos, each lasting 20 minutes. Your narrator, Dr. Anthony.
Syllabus objectives. Describe the mechanism of sex determinations in humans. Predict the results of crosses involving one pair of contrasting characters, including sex-linked characters. The mechanism of sex determinations in humans. Historically, women have been held responsible or blamed for not producing the male heir. King Henry VIII blamed his wife and subsequently had her beheaded for not producing a male heir. Even in our culture at times, you may even hear men blaming their mate for not producing male offspring. Furthermore, you may hear utterings such as, "them back weak." But are women responsible for the sex of the child? Which parent actually determines the gender of the child? The sex of an organism is determined by sex chromosomes, the pair of chromosomes that determine sex in an organism, the X and Y chromosomes in humans. From the meiosis video, you learned that in the male and female gametes, the chromosome number is halved. Thus, each gamete contains only one sex chromosome. The egg made by the mother only contains the X chromosome. The sperm made by the father contains either an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. If the sperm cell which fertilizes the egg cell contains the X chromosome, then the offspring will be female. If the sperm cell which fertilizes the egg cell contains the Y chromosome, then the offspring will be male. Therefore, the father determines the sex of the child with the contribution of either a sperm cell containing the X chromosome or a sperm cell containing the Y chromosome. Sex-linked characters. Genes carried on the sex chromosomes are said to be sex-linked because they are inherited together. In all sex-linked traits, the gene responsible for the characteristic is carried on the X chromosome. The X and Y chromosomes are unidentical. The X chromosome is longer than the Y chromosome. Therefore, characteristics controlled by genes carried by the non-homologous portion of the X chromosome appear in males even if they are recessive. In other words, the Y chromosome lacks alleles.